Thanks, Emily. It's really great to be here. I always feel that the success of an event is really not about the speaker, it's about the audience and the venue. And what could be a more romantic and perfect place to talk about books, even though we're talking about type on screen, sorry. So yeah, I'm just delighted to be here. And I've been doing books with my students at MICA since 2006 in partnership with Princeton Architectural Press. And I'm very proud that those books have had a great life here at the Strand. That's a huge thrill and a huge point of pride for all of us. And so tonight we're going to talk about a couple of the ideas in type on screen, hopefully some trends and thoughts and best fonts to use to take away with you. And I'm going to say a few words at the beginning, and then Javier and Young Sun are going to talk about some of the research that they did. So yeah, this great quote from Marshall McLuhan talks about the fact that the user is the subject of technology, whether it's an electric light, which we have lots of in here, or a book, which we have even more of in here. And this idea of the user being the subject of design is super important when type goes on screen, because type on screen isn't just about choosing the right font or about pixel resolution. It's really about the fact that every time you make a distinction on screen, it implies some kind of action from the user. It's very different from print design. My buddies here have done a great job researching and writing about that in the book. So that idea of the user is really important. I'm going to start with a little story about the history of books. It's kind of a sad story. And maybe we could lower the lights. Is that possible for this? Yeah, we'll see. Oh, thank you so much. So better. So billions of years ago, books ruled the planet, and the big books ate up the little books, and that's how we got footnotes. And then, something terrible happened. A giant meteor crashed into their native habitat. And here's a close-up of what's inside the meteor. And many bookstores perished, luckily not this one, right? So a few great, strong central caves were preserved, but many books perished, and some evolved. And here's some digital readers. And now when I hear the word reader, I often don't think of a girl on a park bench reading a book, but a device, a machine, or a piece of software that is a reader. And we'll talk a little bit about that and the aesthetics of digital reading later in the talk. So I'm going to start talking a little bit about fonts on screen. And this is research done by Christopher Clark, who's actually here in the audience tonight. I'm thrilled to see a bunch of contributors to the book here. And Christopher did this great research on what kind of fonts work on the web in particular. He developed a highly idiosyncratic set of metrics here for evaluating the fitness of various typefaces, including things like classiness, which is, would you take that font to Red Lobster? So it's not a scientific account, but it's a beautiful menu of potential typefaces, all of which have a good life and a sort of demonstrated life on the web, and all of which appeal to Chris and his excellent type on screen sensibility. I'm just going to share 4 of them with you. There's lots more in the book and some other lists as well, Google fonts, other typefaces that we show. So yeah, this typeface, Adele, one of our favorites. And this is really indicative of a trend in web typography, which is a preference for typefaces with strong slab serifs. And they work really well on the web because they have details that hold up even at really shitty resolution. And Adele is a really nice one that we like, and it has enough kind of literary quality to it, and yet is really hefty and strong and kind of web ready. This is DIN, which is kind of on the opposite end of the spectrum. DIN historically was created for signage, for technical use in Germany in the mid-20th century. It became a very popular print face and a very popular typeface for advertising, but especially for signage. And I think it works really well on the web, not so much in the sort of heavy text use, but kind of wayfinding for the web. And there are some good cuts of it, including this one that seems to work well on screen. Yeah, and this is FF TISA, another beautiful whoops, I guess I had the wrong picture. Yeah, Chicago Manual of Style is a great, if I were a typeface, that's where I would want to go to live, right? So FF TISA is another beautiful slab serif, and I think seeing it here gives you a sense of that kind of the literary web. A site like this is really all text. It's all typography, and this typeface works really well in that environment. Yeah, and then finally, Fedra Serif, a beautiful typeface by Peter Bielak. And it's shown here applied to my website, Thinking with Type, which Christopher Clark designed. And it's got small caps, which is a really beautiful thing we don't see enough of on the web. And again, if you're trying to create a more literary kind of textual personality for type on screen, some of these typefaces really work well in bringing a kind of, I don't know, say a spirit of print to the more dynamic and user-oriented and inconsistent landscape of the screen. So Young Sun is going to talk a little bit about flatness.
Hello, everyone. So I'm going to talk a little bit about flatness and how the screen aesthetics have destroyed some of our sacred principles on how we choose color and use color and different effects that... Left or right? That way. So this is a chapter about icons and logo types. And we're kind of, with our mobile devices and screens, we're more and more, we see things in icons and like app icons specifically. So this is what the computer screens we use now as graphic designers and most people used to look like. Bitmapped and black and white and very simple. These icons were developed to communicate an idea about an action because we had to make metaphors for things we do in real life and translate it to the screen so that people understood how to use this thing. So I'm not exactly sure why, you know, a suitcase becomes a type collection, but a trash can for throwing away your documents makes sense, and a watch for waiting time also makes sense. But now, our icons look like these. And this is what I'm talking about when we talk about things that we wouldn't have done maybe 5 or 6 years ago with all the gradients and drop shadows and, you know, super color. And so we see this translation, the Volkswagen and Apple, to the shiny, gradated, shadowed things that they are in modern times. And even tons of color, you know, because we don't have to print these colors, it's really cheap to reproduce these constantly on screen. So we can go with as colorful or as shadowed an idea as we want. And so these shadows and gradients translate to some of the more visible brands of our day. Obama, obviously. And even now identities can move and they can interact with the user as either they're scrolling or when they visit, and it could be video, or it doesn't have to be printed and set in stone anymore. It's another nice little example. This is an identity that my friend Javier here developed for an experimental lab to do with technology and design. And this lived on screen and it wasn't ever printed until the book came along, but it's more comfortable up here than maybe on paper. Here's another example of an identity that can shift and change with the user's preference or on page load. So Javier, again, with a few other students at MICA for our thesis exhibition, developed an identity that would build the letters MFA out of myriad elements in people's work or in our libraries. And so it was an ever-changing, constantly evolving logo that every time you visited the site, it would be something different, which is kind of cool. Though now defunct, this was a really kind of interesting logo. I mean, this is for the television station. So an identity for something that exists on TV should move, right? It shouldn't be static, and it shouldn't do anything besides move and be amazing. And so I'm going to hand it off to Javier, who's going to talk a little bit about Flatness.
So long live Flatness. Hi, I'm Javier. And yeah, I mean, I think it's interesting how everything sort of evolved into this idea of things becoming so sort of skeuomorphic. And nowadays, anybody that uses anything online, your website versus your apps, your phone, are actually turning into quite the opposite. So I was actually leading the type and interface chapter, and one of the interesting things that we found were things like this, right? So it's very apparent that for designers, you actually have, for print designers, there are a different set of restrictions in terms of defining your work. And I feel like an interaction designer actually tends to look at things in a little bit of a different light. So things that you would not consider in print before, you actually you are facing them every day in your job as an interaction designer or as a visual designer for a screen. So one of the few things that we noticed is, for example, on the left side, Apple with their first iOS or iOS 6, and how everything kind of had to obey by these rules of shadows and defining specific spaces where where things are happening. Buttons were actually very well defined, and they actually looked like their counterparts in the physical world, which is what changes with iOS 7, and obviously everybody is pushing this in a way different direction. But no longer do we have to obey by the same rules of defining buttons to look like buttons, defining text, defining all these bubbles to look like they're bejeweled bubbles in quote unquote the physical world. But now we can actually think about things like learned behavior. So for example, the buttons up top don't necessarily need to be defined anymore, and they can actually just be text that that feels like it could be clicked. Reinforcing other different alternative paradigms that actually screen allows us to do. For example, in this case, this idea of light and the light hitting different types of surfaces and allowing you to see sort of transparent backgrounds enough to understand that there's something scrolling under versus something that is happening on top. But notice that pretty much everything else structurally is the same. We still have the going back and forth between two people that are having a conversation. We still have the keyboard actually working in the same way, but everything just looks a lot more light, and negative space all of a sudden it starts to sort of to make its appearance here a lot more prominently. The next thing is here's Young Sun. So the other thing that we were starting to study, and this is actually just a mock-up that we made for the book, but it was just dealing a little bit with what can we expand upon. And one of the interesting things that we find with type specifically on the screen is that we have dynamic spaces versus static spaces. Places where people are actually expecting to read versus places where people are expecting to interact. interact. So how do you actually make that movement as you're making your design decisions, and how do you sort of use type as as another element within the interface? So things like images are happening all over the place and online, but or on the screen. But really, type could become another image. And how do you actually use that body of type? Is kind of like becoming its own challenge by itself. Moving on, like the things like subtle gradients still are happening. Is not necessarily that we're moving away from, we're seeing a shift in terms of people sort of staying away from gradients or shadows. It's just that things are actually happening in a much more subtle way, because you no longer need to sort of mimic the physical world. Now you can actually afford to hinge on the learned behaviors by users to allow you to do a little bit more of a flat surface and a little bit more of a flat aesthetic. Moving on to the next one. This is another book that we made for the. It was another book that we made for the book. It was actually a take on what could happen when a book is actually living on the web. So how do you actually hide versus reveal specific spaces? How do you actually assist the reader for not only the stuff that they're reading, but the stuff that they need to reference? How do you start to create visual markups within the text without necessarily interfering with the main storyline, and actually start to give a little bit more of an idea of a wayfinding for the user as they're going through the website. So this was actually just an exercise in HTML and CSS. It doesn't have anything else but that, and it's actually using typefaces from Typekit. And all of these were actually just developed around the idea of with the book Hilda Cameron and in mind. So again, it's a very contemporary take on what a book could be, but it's just using a website as another way to serve the user a whole bunch of text in a very sort of programmatic way. So you don't need to see like the long website with the 20,000 scrolls. You can actually just start hiding things and revealing things at times, so you can actually sort of start guiding the experience as you go. That being said, Young Sun is back with. Oh, there you go.
That's a nice segue. So from fonts to interface, we talk about what we primarily do on screens and the internet is read. And so, let's talk about that. So this is our new normal, which is sad to say in a room like this, but the familiar shape and the square rectangle lives on in these devices that we carry with us, and I know everyone in this audience has something that looks like one of these in their pocket or purse, and maybe more than one at the same time. I know I have 2 of these with me now. So, and this is what reading has become. So we can, as designers, we need to think about how we look at these and then how we translate our using these into how we'd like to read. So users now more and more, they don't necessarily, they choose what they read, but they also want to choose how, when, where, and for how long they read it. And so this is a really nice example of a contemporary magazine that you can get a print edition, which is this here, and then also you can get it served to your iPad as an EPUB or view it on the website. And the designers have taken that into consideration. They've taken the device they use and then designed around that device for the best and most clear reading experience. It's just a little detail of the website. So it's really, some things that Javier was talking about with Hilda Cameron, where we have footnotes on the side, or not footnotes, we have notes on the side with images not necessarily inline, and then some other little doodads on the right. Twitter, Facebook, sharing these ideas with the greater public, so we share more now what we read, even if we don't read through the whole thing. And this is the text versus the iPad edition. The iPad and ebooks are nice because they order everything in one linear way, and there's only one way to comfortably go, and that's forward. So it's a really nice way. I mean, I've heard something where people are reading more now than ever, and they feel more comfortable reading because they get locked into this mode and they just keep going forward and forward, page after page, and it's a lot easier than even lugging around and carrying a book, you know? Sadly. This is a nice close-up. So I was just talking a little bit about this. So in iBooks and Kindles, you really have little control over what what you can do. You can choose a typeface if you're into that, like we might be. But basically, you chug forward along this little line, or now they have the nice scroll feature where it's not even pages and it's just a long scroll that the whole book is, kind of like On the Road by Kerouac. But then also we have interfaces like this, and Google has now spent tons of money scanning, and we'll try to scan all the books knowable, and now we can search these. And this isn't so much about reading, so you see you have all the distracting things around you. You have the search bar, you have ads, you have, links to go buy this book somewhere, although I don't think you can buy this book. But now you can search the book. You can search a text that's from the 19th century and search for specific keywords, and it's a completely new way of reading and interacting with books that was never available until Google made it available. To search the library here is now super simple with just a little search field. And so this is a little piece I wrote, but this talks about a website called Medium, where a user can read and write in a very similar environment. So it's kind of the reading and writing and editing is all very contained in this beautiful interface. And then the user will then, you can push this out to your blog or your Medium blog, but it's all a very elegant and straightforward way of handling content online and producing content. So the marrying of reading and writing is now something that is open to everybody with, an internet browser. And so I guess I'll hand it over back to Ellen.
So I'm going to end with a little story, a love story called I Hate My Kindle. And then I'm going to have a conversation with Javier and Young Sun, and I have a couple of former students and contributors to the book who I'd love to have come up, and we could talk about a few things related to Type on Screen and have some questions from you guys or comments about where you think type and the book and reading and writing and all that is going. So this is a love story. So there's this girl, and this is all true, it's based on a true story. There's this girl, she meets a Kindle, and she really loves him. He's so cool, and she reads so much more, like Young Sun said. And she loves taking him to the beach, because just like a real book, you can take your Kindle to the beach, and the sun, reflects properly, like on a real piece of paper. And that's pretty great. She's pretty excited. And she has a lot of fun with Kindle. And actually, this has been scientifically proven that people have more fun reading books on digital readers than they do reading paper books. And the scientific study was done where people were given, those two things to choose from. The thing that they were reading was Hemingway stories. And it seems to me that that's a medium that is uniquely suited to reading on a Kindle because it's completely linear. And what Young Sun was saying about the kind of nature of the reading experience on a Kindle is that it's fun if you're reading a story, because stories go from beginning to end. But if you're doing other kinds of activities, other kinds of reading, maybe it isn't such a great tool. And one of the things we talk about in Type on Screen is that reading isn't one thing, and that reading can be a very linear experience, it can be a very literary experience, or it can be very active and very much about the reader doing stuff to text, collecting it, hitting the buttons, clipping it, all that kind of stuff. But reading a story on your Kindle is really fun, and this girl really enjoyed that, who found her Kindle. And then she met iPad, and this was pretty exciting, because when she touches his screen, like, pages would turn. And she found now that when she would go to her Kindle, she would touch his screen, but he would just lie there. Like nothing would happen. And she had to remember like what all those buttons were for. This is like an ancient Kindle with all these weird controls. And it's like, what is that for? And she is distressed. And she finds that she likes taking iPad to bed because he lights up and she can read in the dark. And she's like, I think I'd rather go to bed with iPad than take Kindle to the beach. Because really, like, who goes to the beach anyway? You know, this seemed like a better deal for her. Everything's great, and then her friend gets this new iPad that like talks to her and has all these new features and a better screen and all this stuff. And she's like, well, now what do I do? And it's a real existential crisis where she has to ask herself, like, gosh, my devices keep changing and I'm never satisfied, and can I ever just settle down with one of these things and she really has to just come to terms with the fact that no, it's just going to keep changing and keep evolving, and that's the world we live in. So I'm going to leave it at that in terms of technology and reading in our presentation. But what I'd like to do is we get some lights back on, and I'd love to invite Lily and Chris to come up. Would you be willing to do that and join us? Do I have any other contributors to type on screen here? Oh, and thanks. Applause. That's good. Thank you. Didn't mean to short circuit that. Hi. Thank you, guys. So our book was written collaboratively, and we've been doing this at MICA. Why don't you come on over here, and I think it's better, more central. So we've been doing these books where we come up with a subject, and we try to find a subject that we think is really relevant to readers. All the books that we published at MICA are really tools for people to use. They're invitations for designers and everyday people. Yeah, that's great, thank you. To engage in design, to learn something and do something with design. So we've done books about how to publish a book. We've done books about basic design, about do-it-yourself, and Type on Screen is our latest. And I certainly could never do this without these amazing, talented young people who are really living the world of design very directly as it's changing. And so I wanted to just ask a few questions. You know, Chris, you're really working as a web designer, and I'm curious if you could say something about the state of aesthetics and type on the web.
Sure.
Like, yeah, like Red Lobster kind of stuff. Yeah.
You know, I mean, in my experience, it's getting a lot better. I mean, it's all getting better, right? And typography is no exception. You know, we just switched to Whitney. And it's awesome, you know, and the thing is that as type designers get more experience making, you know, when it came out very quickly, and so a lot of things were rushed, and now we're starting to get things that are really good. Like people,
you mean typefaces?
Yeah, typefaces, yeah, that are hinted for screen and work on screen, and then we're also getting screens that are better too. So, you know, my understanding of it is that it's really getting a lot better. There's a lot more options, and the technology is getting better on the browser side, so that it's easier to add and install and make these and work with these things without having everything break and switch to Helvetica or Arial or something secretly behind your back. So yeah, I mean, onward and upward, I guess, is my perception.
And Young Sun, a lot of what you've been looking at is the aesthetics of print and the aesthetics of reading.
Right, yeah.
Can you say something just about the different, I mean, like, we're here surrounded by books. And I get the question a lot, why did you do a book about type on screen? And we do have a website called typeonscreen.info that has some of the multimedia stuff on it, but it is not a replacement for the book, because I think the book has like a super great interface, you know, like you can turn the pages, and the resolution is excellent.
Always.
Totally dig that. But maybe just talk about, I feel like the example of the Peter Belak Works That Work, that magazine that's published in print and EPUB and PDF, which I think is really cool.
Oh, yeah.
Like, what's with that, and tell me about the aesthetics of like type and reading.
Jumping off from what Chris was talking about, it's like it's getting a lot better too for controlling how text looks on a screen and CSS3 and new standards are popping up where we can now, kern typefaces, we can use alternate characters. Type designers are building all these little goodies that we as designers really love to use as much and often as possible in our OpenType glyphs palettes in our various softwares. So we have more characters, we have more fine control, so we can do things like indent every paragraph after the first, things that are kind of tried and true book type design mantra-y things, and we can kind of recreate those on screen. So it's actually bringing the world of print and the world of screen typography closer and closer together with some of these new advances, and there's tons of reading online about it, and it's getting better and better every day. But I think it's really interesting what Peter Bielak did with Works at Work is, first it's a great magazine about things that designers might care about, but presenting it in a way that designers love and everybody kind of loves. And I've spoken to people about it, people who aren't designers who have picked it up. I think it's a really kind of a stellar way of handling content now, is that you don't just publish a book or a magazine.
You can buy something and get it in more than one edition.
Right,
that's really cool.
It's a really...
So Lily, you contributed to the chapter about code and creating typefaces and letter forms and processing, which is like an aesthetic that has nothing to do with print and is often not about reading at all. But can you talk a little bit about type kind of becoming this weird, strange animal that morphs and...
Yeah, I feel like actually just reminded me of one story of my coworker, and he's working on Yahoo website and try to bring more fun to that website. He just bring some code animation. So actually the audience, the reader, the website reader can interact with it. So which is this new thing to website.
And what kind of interaction? Like when you say interact?
Some of them is sound interaction, like when you move your mouse to different corner, you get different weird Yahoo voice, Yahoo.
Well, now I want to just break
some weird things. But it's when you read the book, you never experienced that before, because you can interact with this website and you can telling the story from different perspective. So you're more into that. And of course you will have a print version beside you. That's kind of like telling the same story from different perspective. Kind of make the story more juice, more rich, and pushing more closer to you. Yeah.
Thank you, great. And then I want to just ask Javier a question, then I want to open it up to the audience for comments or questions that you guys might have. So Javier, you're working really as an interaction designer at local projects?
Close to it, yeah. More like a graphic designer that works a lot with interaction designers.
So tell me how typography plays a role in the work that you're doing.
Sure. One thing that has been really interesting working with interaction designers is the mere concept of a paradigm is completely different to anything that happens on the print side. Like print designers don't tend to think about things in a very static way, in a very sort of guided way, and I think that there's a lot of moving pieces. There's a lot of added metrics and mediums that happen once you move into the screen they're actually quite interesting and quite creative. So things like time, things like interaction, clicking on things, interacting with things, using gestures, using installation pieces, especially in installation pieces, end up letting type not only be about telling a specific story in a paragraph, but it could actually become sometimes like another element that you can play with. You can rotate your...
It's part of the interface often, right?
Exactly. So the typeface or icons are not the only interface anymore, or not the only ways of getting into an interface anymore, especially in installation. So then your body, like just the stuff that we've been experimenting with lately, is just using your body as another interface, in which typefaces don't really play a big role, but they definitely do to still serve the same purposes of letting people digest information, and that is really ultimately what we're aiming for.
Great, thanks. So does anyone have a comment or question? I think we could talk about how you read. I'm always really curious. Here we are in a room full of books, and I still buy a lot of books. I only read about 5% of them. But I also read on my phone, and I'm curious your experiences or thoughts about typography and the screen and this world of long form, short form, whatever. So, any comments or questions? Yeah.
I feel some of the name right now. It's the Unicode Consortium Institute for the body that does emoji, like other people that I understand they're releasing another 200 or 300 in the coming weeks or soon, right? I'm sure it's going to be an iPhone here. I was curious about in the world of half tile, like modular, shifting around ways to pictorially tell a story without words. If that figures into what you guys are thinking about.
Yeah, I mean, we have this whole chapter on icons and logo types and the sort of history of them and the current design of them, and the idea of fonts, logo, fonts that are symbol fonts, like Peter Bielak is doing amazing typefaces that have icons in different weights that match the weight of the typeface, and they're monospaced uniform width so that they can be used in information graphics and really be controlled like a font. I think that's a really interesting development, that in this world that is so icon-centered and looking for kind of nonverbal communication, that the idea of the font, right, and Unicode treating them as, these unique characters that have some kind of basis to them, right, I think is really interesting.
Yeah,
you guys want to?
People are more and more using things like that. I just came across emojitracker.com. I don't know if anybody's seen it. And basically, like when you get there, there's an epilepsy warning. And basically, it blinks. It has a grid of all the emojis, and then each emoji will blink every time it's used on Twitter. And the whole thing is lighting up constantly. And so you see how many emojis are being used, and there's counters for each specific one, and they're ranked, but which one is used the most. So it just kind of shines a light on these new forms of communication and how emojis are essentially, for all intensive purposes, kind of typographic in a lot of respects.
They're characters, right?
Emojitracker.com, I think, is what I just stumbled on it today.
So it's sort of taking the emotional temperature of the world.
Exactly. I
right
mean, I wish it was on a map.
So interesting.
That's the next step, is to have them popping on the world map or something. But yeah, it's an amazing new.
Where the happy people are. I want to meet them.
Where all the pizza is.
Any other questions or comments? Yeah.
So much I think of like me going to buy the book is the cover attracts me. You don't really have that on EPUBs. How do you think that's going to translate to see stuff like that? Are the contents and the typography of the book itself becoming more important because you don't have the cover as a
Well, the covers are actually still really important, but they have to be able to communicate really small on, I'm sorry to say, Amazon.com, which is sort of a big bookstore that we all have to rely on. Or in a reader where the image of the book, but it becomes almost like a logo. So this whole idea of the app icons that are a logo for the product, but also a kind of way into the product. They're almost like the book cover for an app. And in a sense, a book cover has become like an app icon, something that has to operate at all these different scales and communicate no matter what, So I think book covers are still really important, but they do have an intense digital life. Yeah.
In adding on to that, I think the other interesting part is that really I think the music industry kind of like shaped that as well, because now album covers are actually really whatever you see on your iTunes collection, and I think that really goes to...
It is like an app icon.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So it's getting smaller, but that doesn't mean that it's not being it's still a creative endeavor. It's just another way of manifesting the same idea.
Even for a printed book, that icon is really important and becomes a kind of symbol, for the book. I mean, like every Malcolm Gladwell book basically has the same cover because they're all trying to be the same bestseller. And then you see other guys copying that covers for their airport books to look like Malcolm Gladwell. It's all, a kind of icon. Yeah. Other comments? Yeah.
So I think a lot of brands and companies will try and have like similar typefaces and their website and their printed menus or whatever. I haven't dug into the book yet, but I was curious if the reading system is flexibility, like if it translates well from print to screen.
The reading system? How do you mean?
Sorry, the reading system.
Oh, I don't know. You guys will have to answer this. You know anything about that?
Been a while, but yeah. As I remember it, flexibility was. I actually think flexibility was more about how the typeface, or a font as it is in terms of pixels on a screen, would translate from browser to browser. So something, especially, it's getting better now, as I said earlier, but still you can have a font that looks really great on your $2,000 Macintosh computer, but then you get it on a low, like a low contrast window, like older Windows computer, and it just totally turns into mush. So I think that is actually what I meant by flexibility, but don't quote me on that.
Are you referring to the rating system in the book? I wasn't clear on that. Yeah, got it. Well, it's very idiosyncratic and, yeah, interesting.
And there are also tons of...
But yeah, I think flexibility was about print to screen, and amphibious was across browsers. Right?
No, I think the other way. I don't know.
Well, anyway.
One of those two.
He's just the author. What can you do with these people? Pretty soon we'll get out some whiskey and a cigar, and Any other questions? Yes, kind of.
Thinking in the course of specifically literary history, if we acknowledge that technology shapes literary endeavors, so Shakespeare was writing at the time before the printing press when he wrote plays. The last few centuries have been dominated by the novel and the printing press. I wonder where you think literature is headed with e-readers and what might the novel be?
Well, I think like Tao Lin is a great example of a modern writer who writes for the screen. I mean, his books are so, I forget the one, but it's the Shoplifting from American Apparel is all conversation. It's like you're having a conversation with, like how we interact now is through text messages and emails and tweets, and it's all really kind of a performance in some ways. We're constantly, we're writing constantly to our friends and to anonymous people on the internet, and we're, publishing also constantly and compiling. That is a new, kind of way of writing. So we have, people in the microprogram, they made a blog for 100 days, and now that blog has turned into a book. And so that road of, blogs becoming books is exploded, I feel. And, every other day I see a new blog has a book deal or something, and 40 Days of Dating is a book now.
Deals, so. Yeah, and I think there's a lot of writers who are influenced by that multimedia, like the book Where'd You Go, Bernadette, which is all like documents and emails, or Super Sad True Love Story. And those are really fun books to read on a device or on paper. I think another aspect of your question is really the business of publishing, which is related to technology but is not always in sync with it. And I think that will have, I think what's unfolding now with Amazon and so forth is maybe more important than the technology is the business, how that shapes what the possibilities are for a writer or a publisher. So that'll be interesting and scary to watch how all that happens. But technology and business, yeah, those definitely create a climate for writing and reading. Yeah?
Speaking of Amazon, it seems like every time it comes up in context like this, it's kind of a racist, but it becomes kind of a evil and personal thing. And I just wonder what all you think about, can that actually continue? Because a lot of people love books, don't necessarily love books, and it's when they get sort of what?
That what?
I'm just wondering to see how will that play out. At some point, will we want to backlash, or will we want alternatives, or will it always just be there and be so important for possibly?
I don't know. I mean, I can't predict the future except of type, But I don't know. I think we're all very worried and concerned about the kind of ecosystem of not just print but publishing at large, and what will happen. I think that I think that people are reading a lot, right? And there's a lot of appetite for reading, and Young Sun talked about that. And people are reading in all different media. And I think it's really important that people can get their media from different places. I don't think it's good for everything to come from one source. And we need diversity of where, not just what people read, but what it looks like, where they got it, who profits from it. So I'm for that future where we can all just get along and read a lot of books and sell a lot of books, because you can't have books without the economic system that comes with them, you know?
There's a company called Kodak.
Kodak.
All eventually happens without one imaginary book.
Yeah.
You mentioned the similarity of blogs to ebooks. Do you think that they'll work together? Like, do you think people want to talk about a book as they're reading it? Like, with an interactive game or even a tweet?
Yeah, I do. And I've come across platforms that let you do that. There's, I forget what it's, Taptastic or something. It's an app where it's just super quick stories where you're just tapping. Speaking of linear, you can't go backward, you can only go forward, and you can, every so often you'll get to a slide and you can opt to like tweet that slide out to, or what you think about it. Like, so they interrupt your reading with these opportunities to share what you're reading with people who don't care about what you're reading. So I mean, I think people are trying to do things like that, and I think it's hard to know what 8-year-olds, 9-year-olds now how they're gonna read and how they're gonna handle stuff like that. And I imagine that that is a possible avenue where they will want to constantly share what they're reading, and I mean, I just think with their friends or whatever, it's gonna be, hopefully it'll become a kind of social glue that holds social media together, maybe in some way.
Also, never underestimate where people will try to stick sharing social links anywhere. Anywhere.
But there are, yeah.
Just that, adding on to that, I think the act of reading is kind of shifting. So it's not, I don't think reading is necessarily only about reading words in a piece of paper. So, I think the New York Times is actually doing a lot of really interesting work with long-form journalism, where it's no longer only about the story that is being written, it's also about the accompanying images, the infographics, the videos, the animations as you're going down. And I think that, we're moving more towards the experience of reading, and I feel like that is the opportunity for designers. So how do we actually shape that in a way in which we have a bigger tool set, and we might as well use it. So why not just make an animation with your book? And I think that is just as interesting. And talking about all these these 8-year-olds that are reading now, that's how they're reading.
I hope they're reading.
I hope so too. But they are coming up within a world that is doing that, and they may actually shape the internet in a way better way than we can. So we might as well just start using it for those purposes.
I think we'll take one more question, and then we'll close it out. And we're happy to talk to anybody, personally. Yeah. Hi.
I may be right, but I wanted to know because
Yeah.
you will do electric light or a camera or a light or a book.
Why I put that there as our epigram? Well, so the idea that, McLuhan is really famous for saying the medium is the message, meaning that if you have a book, it's really about print, or you have a movie, it's really about making movies. And this was a later quote. It's from 1971. The user is the content. And I think that is such a modern or postmodern idea, and it so relates to type on screen, because we're always thinking about the user in a way that traditional writing isn't. You don't act on it, right? And so the notion that there wouldn't be electric light bulbs if people didn't use them, there wouldn't be books if people didn't use them, and that the receiver, right, the person who receives the technology or the object, is always figured in the design, right? So that's why we put that there, and we thought it was really cool that he wrote that in 1971, and that it is so much about the whole interactive product world of today, where technology is embedded in the things that we use, and we're constantly interacting and communicating and having feedback with the stuff that we use.
I'm trying to make sense of it sort of the non, like I'm thinking about a hammer.
But a hammer only exists because people have nails that they have to drive, you know.
So
and you couldn't have nails with...
What about the role of a creative? So I have a hammer, and I'm building a house. So is my actor building the house the concept? Is the house the concept? Is that I'm just playing?
No, you as the user of the house becomes the content, and that's really his point. It's another take on the death of the author, right? And another take on taking that agency away from the creator and putting it on the reader, on the receiver, on the audience that makes typography come alive, right? It's meant to be read and used, and that's why we thought that was such a cool idea, and that it put a book right in there with a hammer, which I really love, because our books are all tools. They're all meant to be used. They're not literature. They're not poetry. They are useful guides to doing. And so I love that a book is like a hammer. Yeah, so I'm glad you asked, because I feel very passionate about that. Yeah, so thanks a lot, and thank you to the Strand. We're really so proud to be here. It's like a super lifetime thrill to be at the Strand, right? Yeah? Okay. Yes, right, that's on the bucket list. And yeah, again, we're happy to chat with you forever. Okay, bye.